All right, I'm going to go ahead and read aloud assigned places. As I'm reading aloud, I do want you to follow along on your paper. So let's start with the title, Assigned Places. When one thinks of the past, many images come to mind. One of the most predominant images of the early 20th century in the South was the colored and white signs that dotted the landscape across the South. Those signs were the visible images that constantly reminded African Americans of their place in a white society. In storefront windows, waiting rooms, and public accommodation facilities, segregation signs appeared. Segregation, or racial separation, was carried out by the legislature of southern states enacting laws. The earliest laws legalized segregation in trains and other forms of public transportation where blacks and whites mingled. Eventually, a complex web of statutes created a color line that separated the races. These statutes came to be known as Jim Crow laws. The term Jim Crow denotes a policy of segregation. North Carolina enacted segregation laws that mandated the separation of citizens by race or color. As those segregation laws became entrenched, so did social customs and practices that accompanied Jim Crow. One of the areas where the image of segregation was most visible in North Carolina in the 1920s was in education. The General Assembly had designated funds to support a statewide system of public education in 1907. With such funding, the State Department of Public Instruction began to build schools on a segregated basis. Public elementary schools for African Americans were built in 1910, and in 1918, the first public secondary school for African Americans was established. Most such high schools were limited to only 1 or 2 years. Between 1923 and 1929, public high schools for African Americans were built in larger counties in North Carolina. Second Ward High School in Charlotte opened in 1923, and students traveled from every direction to attend. However, segregation was not limited to separate black, white, and American Indian children in North Carolina's public schools. Segregation extended to restaurants, travel, amusement and recreation facilities, libraries, hospitals, prisons, housing, and municipal services such as fire stations. Restaurants did not seat minorities in the dining room, and movie theaters had balcony seating for African Americans. There were separate libraries and hospitals, or white hospitals had a separate ward where African American patients were treated. With the enactment of segregation laws, customs and practices evolved that became part of the Jim Crow system. Although these customs and practices existed, there were no tactile laws that the legislature passed. African Americans had to adhere to rigid customs and practices in their daily contact with whites. It was the custom for African Americans to always address whites as Mr., Miss, and Ma'am, while whites called African Americans by their first name, or simply sister and boy, regardless of their ages. Another custom was for African Americans shopping at white shops and stores to enter through the back door and wait till the white patrons were helped. Segregation laws, customs, and practices led some African Americans to establish businesses, restaurants, funeral homes, and stores that served the African American community. By the 1920s, Durham had a thriving African American business district made up of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which provided financing for numerous additional black businesses that opened during the decade. North Carolina, like most southern states in the 1920s, was rigidly segregated. Jim Crow was a system designed to let African Americans know their place and to keep them in it. Relegated to second-class citizenship, African Americans across the state, from cities and towns to rural areas, endured a system of segregation while building their own institutions. All right, so now you're going to go to the guided questions, and you'll notice there are 6. Number 1, what is segregation? Number 2, list at least three examples of places where segregation occurred. Number 3, what's the most surprising thing you learned while reading the passage and why? Number 4, how do you think African Americans felt during this period and also why? Number 5, how did the laws support segregation? And number 6, how did people's behavior and cultural norms further enforce segregation? So you're going to go back and use the text to answer these questions.